in English as a second language?
Yes.
Okay. Good, well, I'm glad to see you, and I hope I can help you out. One of the things that I always tell my students is to raise your hand if you don't understand something, or if I'm speaking too fast. History teachers get real excited about history, so, and we're in a period that I really enjoy. So sometimes I have a tendency to keep on going, and I don't look out and make sure that you're all getting everything. And I would always tell you that it's good to ask a question because the person next to you probably has the same question, they just don't want to ask it, so it's okay, there's no such thing. And it doesn't hurt my feelings for you to ask any questions or do anything, so. As a little background on what I'm going to talk about, the period that we're in the classes I'm teaching right now is from 1820 to 1860. This is a period of rapid technological change, rapid change in our government, and really in the way people live. If you were born in 1800 and you suddenly lived and you suddenly woke up and you were in 1860, you would be living in a whole different life in a whole different way. None of you can imagine living without a cell phone planted on your ear, or driving in a car, maybe flying. But if you were born in 1800, they had no idea what a cell phone was. They didn't. I mean, most people had a log cabin, a very plain house. In 1840, we began the development of the newest technology, which was the telegraph. I call the telegraph the first text messaging instrument. Everybody uses text messaging, I imagine, in this class. The telegraph was really that way. Does anybody know what a telegraph is? You've seen that where you use the Morse code? Well, that was the first text message that was going on. That started in 1840, and that was Samuel F.B. Morse, M-O-R-S-E. And he developed a system where we set up a telegraph in Houston, and you could wire it to Galveston, later on to Dallas, later on to San Antonio, and all around. And that was the first real instant communication. Before that, it would take days to get information. In the War of 1812, and you don't have to write this down, but just for your information, the War of 1812 was over while General Andrew Jackson fought the most important battle. But we didn't know. We had signed a treaty in France in 1814 in December, and he fought the Battle of New Orleans and won the battle, drove the British out, except it didn't count because they had already given up. Their troops didn't know, and our troops didn't know. So the instant communications that came about in the 1840s changed the way we did everything, whether it was fighting wars or passing information between each other. So probably if you were thinking of this period of 1820 to 1860, you would think of the tremendous technology changes. The first one being the telegraph we just talked about. You could think about the steamboat. Has anybody been on the Mississippi River and seen steamboats going up and down? No? Okay. Everybody know, if I said steamboat, what would that imply to you?
People used to travel in that.
Yes, up and down. And it had a steam engine in the back, so it was coal-fired typically, and it had big paddle wheels in the back. When I lived in St. Louis, does everybody know where St. Louis is, up on the Mississippi River? It's a little, quite a ways north. When I lived there, I used to go through old newspapers. I'm kind of weird. I like to just read old newspapers and see what goes on. And I found some from back in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. And one of the things I noticed in there was that steamboats blew up all the time. So they speeded up travel, and they made it much easier to go up and down the Mississippi River and the Ohio River and in those areas. But you kind of had to be careful because not infrequently you might not wake up the next day when you're trying to wake up. A lot of boats blew up, and people died, a lot got hurt, freight got lost. So the steamboat, while it was a big improvement, was sometimes not so good. But the steamboats really came into play on the Mississippi River after the 1850s, so we saw that transportation change. Probably the biggest change, and one of the most important technologies that happened for the United States at this time was the railroad. Now, you guys probably only see railroads with freight cars out here. I don't even know if Amtrak comes to Houston. They come once in a while, but on the East Coast, you see the trains running with passenger cars. You don't see that much out here. With the introduction of the train, we now can go take trips that used to take a month or more, sometimes 2 months, and do it in a few days. We did not have a transcontinental railroad, which means we didn't have a railroad that ran from New York to San Francisco until after the Civil War. Most of the railroads ran up to the Mississippi, then you had to take a ferry across and go across. There was not, I think it was right before the Civil War that we had the first bridge in Davenport, Iowa, that would take trains across. But the train stopped before it got to Omaha. The train was probably the most interesting to me. I've always been interested in the way railroads started and some of the things that happened with them, especially after the Civil War. But I remember this, reading this article that the editor of one of the Boston newspapers wrote, and I think this was about 1845. And he said, why would anybody ride in a box with 30 or 40 people with sparks coming in, because there was a stack on the front of the engine, and the sparks, you've never seen anything like this, but when you have a boiler fire, whether it's coal or wood, sparks come out. And they would blow in the open windows because you had to have the windows open in the summertime because it was hot. They didn't have air conditioning. Air conditioning was whatever blew in. So you have sparks flying in, so you're kind of patting your arms every so often, or somebody's patting you on the back and they're really trying to put the sparks out. So he says, why would you want to ride in some box with 30 or 40 hot, sweaty people? If you wanted a drink, the conductor would come around. He had a little pail. He had a dip. He dipped some water out, and you took your dip with everybody else. Nowadays, we would not even think of doing that, but that's what they did because there was no water fountain. We didn't have little plastic bottles of water to carry on board with us. And then, of course, you didn't want to drink too much because there was no bathroom on the car. So you had to think about that, and it would only stop every so often, so you might have that problem. There was no electricity, so if you wanted to read, you had to sit near the window, which might make it kind of windy and hard to read. Or if you wanted to, put your window up, but it might get hot and stuffy. So he said, why would people want to do that? In the winter, it's extremely cold. And of course, at those times, men went around spitting because they chewed tobacco. Sometimes people would smoke in there because back in those days, we didn't know that cigarette smoking was bad for you, and cigars. So they smoked their cigar and cigarettes, so you didn't have to buy cigarettes, I guess, because you got their secondhand smoke for free. So this newspaper editor was quite appalled at the condition of the railroads and could not comprehend why anybody would ride a train. Well, as it turns out, he was wrong. Railroads sprang up all over the country. People couldn't wait to take a train because now, even though the train only went from New York to Davenport or New York to East St. Louis, you could make a trip in less than 2 days that used to take days, if not weeks, to get there. And now we could get wheat from the Midwest around Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, and ship it back to New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, places that didn't have that easy access. So freight rates came down, which means that it costs less to ship goods back and forth across the country. Chicago became a major transportation hub for many, many years. I guess it still is, really, with the railroads. St. Louis did to some lesser extent. So we find another one of the things that happened out of all this, population is moving west because they can. And in America, people have always been on the move.